I have the distinct pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Michael Wagner. Dr. Michael Wagner is an independent researcher and writer, a columnist for the Western Standard. He is a PhD in political science from the University of Alberta. Dr. Wagner is the author of several books, including Time to Leave, Canada Cannot Be Fixed, No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta, Anglosphere's Broken Covenant, very good book, The Christian Citizen's Guide, Leaving God Behind, the Charter of Rights in Canada's Official Rejection of Christianity, and Michael is Right, a Christian Response to Canada's Liberal Left. Dr. Wagner and his wife have 11 children, and they've been home educating for about 30 years, so they're way ahead of the curve. Susan Hearn said of Dr. Wagner, he is an anomaly because he is a man who knows who he is and what he believes. Let's give a great welcome for Dr. Michael Wagner.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I just have to adjust this a bit with my old man eyes. I can't see the way that I used to. I got to make sure the words are at the right distance. So this afternoon I'm going to be speaking about Christian influence in 20th century Alberta. And you might wonder, what's the big deal about Christian influence in Alberta in the 20th century? Well, the relevance will become apparent as I talk, but I want to start out explaining the relevance actually with a recent news article. Back in July, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, visited some evangelical churches. And this caused quite an uproar among leftists in Canada, criticizing him for attending evangelical churches and trying to get the support of evangelical Christians. And so I printed off an article here. It's a column by Brian Lilly from the Ottawa Sun. And he starts up, it's called Liberals Freak Out Over Poilievre Meeting Christians. And it starts this way. The reaction to Pierre Poilievre visiting a number of Christian churches lately would make you think The Handmaid's Tale was about to move from fiction to reality. Now, if you don't know, The Handmaid's Tale is a novel written by a famous Canadian author named Mark. Involved in politics, and so she misrepresents what a society would look like if Christians came into power. But so the purpose of that book was to, scare people about Christians, and Brian Lilly is saying that. So because of Pierre Poilievre visiting those churches, the leftists who are tweeting that Poilievre was trying to bring religion into politics in Canada. And one liberal commentator wrote, "The far-right evangelical Christian movement is a scourge on our politics. They're a dangerous lot, yet these are the sort of groups Poilievre seeks out." Now, Brian Lilly have a very good commentary on this, because he pointed out the hypocrisy of these liberals. Brian Lilly wrote, "None of these liberals complain when Poilievre visits mosques, synagogues, gurdwaras, or temples, just evangelical churches." So these leftists, they're not concerned about mixing religion and politics. They're only concerned about mixing evangelical Christianity and politics. But if a politician goes to a mosque or gurdwara or whatever, like Brian Lilly said, there's no controversy at all. The controversy was only because he visited an evangelical church. Now that makes what I'm about to say relevant, because in Alberta, in the past, having evangelical Christians involved in politics was the norm. For Christians not to be involved today is different from Alberta's past. Like I'm going to talk about the mid-20th century in particular, and there's two people who stand out, two premiers, Bible Bill Aberhart, followed by Ernest Manning. Both of them were prominent evangelical leaders. Both of them were radio preachers at the same time as they were premiers of Alberta. So it was not controversial at all back in the 20th century for Alberta premiers to be evangelical Christians and to be openly so and speak about it openly. So I'll begin with William Aberhart because he's first chronologically. So William Aberhart was born in 1878 in Perth County, Ontario. During his high school years, he had a conversion experience and became an evangelical Christian. He was influenced by well-known evangelical leaders of the time, such as D.L. Moody and C.I. Schofield. And Aberhart was very interested in particular in studying Bible prophecy. Now, for an occupation, he became a school teacher. He was a very successful school teacher, and he was rapidly promoted. So by his late 20s, he was already the principal of Brantford's Central Public School in Brantford, Ontario. Now, the Calgary Public School Board wanted to hire Aberhart because he was so popular. So in 1910, they offered him a good salary to move to Calgary to become a principal there, and he rose rapidly through the ranks of principals in Calgary and became the principal of Crescent Heights High School in 1915. Now, besides his career as a high school principal, he became very well known as a Bible study teacher. In 1918, he started teaching Bible studies at Westbourne Baptist Church in Calgary, which at the time was a very small church, but it grew very rapidly because of the popularity of Aberhart's teaching. Wherever Aberhart taught Bible studies, large numbers of people would attend. Many people would attend, especially because it was teaching on Bible prophecy. Now, by 1925, his Bible study was so popular that he was filling the Palace Theatre in Calgary each Sunday with an audience of 2,500 people. 2,500 people on Sunday afternoons would come here to teach. You have to remember, back in those days, the population of Calgary was about 80,000. So it was less than 10%, like back then it was less than 10% than it is now, and yet he was having 2,500 people come on Sundays for his Bible study. Because he was so popular, he was encouraged to go on the radio with his Bible study teaching. Back then, of course, radio was a relatively new technology. So in 1925, November 1925, he began broadcasting over radio station CFCN in Calgary, which was the most powerful radio station in Western Canada at that time. And his radio program was an instant hit. Before long, there'd be families all over Alberta gathering on Sunday afternoon around the radio program to listen to his 2-hour radio preaching. So yeah, it was a two-hour radio program, and within a very short period of time, he had a radio audience of 350,000 people. Now that's significant because the population of Alberta was about 700,000. So his radio program reached a little bit into Saskatchewan and into BC. So the 350,000 weren't all in Alberta, but still his radio audience was pretty close to half of the population of Alberta. Now, like I mentioned, radio was the new technology at that time, so this is very significant. There's no TV or internet or anything. Radio was the cutting edge technology, so people were getting radios. And his influence was spreading rapidly throughout Alberta in particular, into a little bit into other Western provinces. In 1927, Aberhart founded the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute. It actually had its own location in Calgary. And so from the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute, he would hold worship services, Bible studies, formal classes, and radio broadcasts were conducted from there. Now, in 1929, the Great Depression began. Up until that time, Aberhart had not been involved in politics at all. He was very distressed by the effects he could see from the Depression, the effects it was having on people, and one of his own students committed suicide, which really affected him personally and made him want to find a solution for the Depression. So when he was marking exams in Edmonton during the summer of 1932, he was encouraged by another teacher named Charles Scarborough to read a book called Unemployment or War by Maurice Colborne. That was a kind of an introductory text to the social credit economic ideas. So Aberhart read that book that night, like he just sat down and read the entire book through, and he figured that the social credit theory was the economic theory that would solve Alberta's economic problems for the Depression. Because he believed that, he started using his radio program, which was already widespread and popular, to promote social credit theory to people and to encourage people to study it. Now, social credit and economic theory was created by a guy named Major C.H. Douglas, a British engineer. Social credit economic theory is not easy to explain. I'm not sure that I fully understand it. But the main idea is that credit should be issued by the government in the interest of the people rather than by banks. Like the way it is now, credit is offered by banks, private banks, for the benefit of the banks. And the social credit theory was, well, if the government offers the credit in the interest of the people rather than in the private interest of the bank, perhaps that would lead to the solution to the Depression. It was not a socialistic program. It wasn't about the government controlling the economy. We still have private enterprise, private property, and all those kind of things. It was just focusing on credit, how money and credit was issued. So back during the Depression, of course, people were looking for solutions. What is the solution to this huge economic problem that we're having? And so people were open to the social credit idea that Aberhart was promoting, and many Albertans bought into that and accepted it. So Aberhart created an organization called the Douglas Social Credit League, and he trained up people who would speak on behalf of that organization, and they would speak in homes and schools and halls to teach people of the social credit ideas. So they have study groups, social credit study groups, and by 1935, there were about 1,600 social credit study groups throughout Alberta. Now, the government of that time was the United Farmers of Alberta. It's actually the same United Farmers of Alberta. You might see some of their things around, but back in those days, among other things that they, like besides supplying farm supplies and things like that, they were also a political organization. They haven't been now for a long time, but they were a political organization, and they were the governing party from about about 1921 to 1935. But anyway, they were the governing political party at the time that Aberhart was first promoting social credit. He went to the UFA government and tried to convince them of the need to implement social credit ideas, but they rejected him completely. So he decided to create a social credit political party to run candidates in the next provincial election, and he used his radio audience, of course, to promote his ideas. So it was widely spread, and the social credit party was actually formed. Now, Aberhart already had, of course, a lot of prestige as a prominent religious leader in Alberta, and many people who weren't necessarily interested in his religious ideas nevertheless looked up to him as a leader. Like he had those kind of charismatic traits of a leader that we sometimes see in people that are very attractive, that there's something about them that we think we can trust them and put our confidence in them. Also, Aberhart's public speaking abilities were second to none. Like when you read about Aberhart during the 1935 campaigns, it actually brings back images of when you think about, these Donald Trump rallies where there's tens of thousands of people and everybody's cheering. Like that's the kind of thing it seems like when you read about Aberhart and his speaking abilities, because during that 1935 election campaign, the United Farmers of Alberta politicians and the Liberal politicians were having a hard time getting audiences. But Aberhart himself had no problem getting audiences. And there was a University of Toronto political scientist named John Irving who wrote this about Aberhart and his speaking and his meetings. Excuse me, he wrote, "Wherever Aberhart appeared, the roads leading to that place would be jammed with traffic, all headed for the meeting place. The large audiences that always assembled would await his arrival with spontaneous expectancy. His appearance on the platform would be greeted with waves of thunderous applause. Even in small or remote villages like Sylvan Lake or Marwayne, there was no relaxation of the heightening tempo of his campaign. The people who flocked to his meetings, invariably overcrowded, wanted a good show and they always got it. The great spellbinder never failed to lift his audience to a state of hysterical enthusiasm." So people loved to hear Aberhart speak and were willing to go to wherever he was to hear him speak in person. So when the election was held on August 22nd, 1935, Social Credit won 56 of 63 seats in the legislature with over 54% of the vote. So it was a landslide victory for Social Credit and William Aberhart. So he gave his victory speech that night at the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute, and he closed his speech as follows. Listen to this. Aberhart said, I want personally to give thanks to the Almighty God in heaven for his guidance and direction in this whole matter. I assure you that it is our intention to submit our deliberations to his divine guidance and wisdom. Since he seems to be calling us to a place of leadership, we trust that our people will put their trust in him and not fail. Follow your government with your prayers. Remember our theme song, O God, our help in ages past. So that's from the victory speech of the new Premier of Alberta giving praise to God. So the victory of the Social Credit Party was news or front page news around the world. Some places considered it to be Alberta heading into a disaster, others kind of celebrated it. But in 3 short years, the social credit idea went from being an obscure economic theory to being the guiding philosophy of a new political movement that governed Alberta. And as that political scientist John Irving wrote, it is doubtful if that movement would have won political power without Aberhart's leadership, because his leadership was so central to the creation and success of the social credit movement. I mean, basically, Aberhart was a leader like Alberta and Canada had never seen before. He was a unique phenomenon in terms of the kind of leadership that he offered and his ability to win in 1935. Now, there was also a federal social credit party formed later that year, and it won 15 out of 17 federal seats for Alberta in the federal election later that year. Now, the social credit legislation focused a lot on financial matters, monetary matters, which are not part of the provincial jurisdiction. They're actually part of the federal government's jurisdiction. So various laws that the Alberta government would bring forward to implement the social credit theory were actually struck down by the federal government because they were outside of Alberta's jurisdiction. So there was a lot of conflict between the Alberta government and the federal government at that time. Aberhart won re-election in 1940 with a much reduced majority, and then he died in 1943 while he was still premier. Now, Aberhart had two particularly significant effects on Alberta. First of all, Aberhart, with his radio program, took evangelical Christianity into almost every household in Alberta, through his radio program. So from a religious perspective, he had a big influence on Alberta with his preaching. And secondly, from a political perspective, his creation of the Social Credit Party created a new political reality in Alberta. The Social Credit Party would be consistently in power in Alberta from 1935 until 1971, and then for 10 years later after that, it was still the official opposition. So he changed Alberta's political situation altogether. Now, Aberhart was kind of the major evangelical leader in Alberta in the 1920s, but there was also one that I should mention because he's important as well. His name was Leslie E. Maxwell, and he was associated with the Prairie Bible Institute in Three Hills. So the Prairie Bible Institute was founded in 1922 when a farmer named Fergus Kirk invited Ellie Maxwell to come and teach students some Bible studies. This proved to be very popular, and so Prairie Bible Institute soon became the biggest Bible college in Canada. Now, by the late 1920s, Ellie Maxwell and Aberhart were friends. They would work together, and sometimes Ellie Maxwell would preach at the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute. They did have some doctrinal differences, which kept them becoming very close. But when the Social Credit Party was founded, Ellie Maxwell and Aberhart had a big break. Ellie Maxwell did not believe in social credit theory. He thought it was wrong to use like a religious radio program for political ideas. So the friendship between Maxwell and Aberhart was over. Most evangelical Christians in Alberta supported Aberhart in that, and so Prairie Bible Institute at that time lost about 2/3 of their support.
2 years later, because in 1938 they brought an evangelist for Moody Bible Institute named Oscar Lowry to Alberta to preach over the CFCN radio in the Prairie Bible Institute's radio broadcast. So this Oscar Lowry, his preaching was very popular, and within a few weeks there were thousands of letters coming in and thousands of dollars in donations, and apparently over 1,000 reported conversions. Because of the influence of Oscar Lowry's preaching on the radio, created a bit of a revival in Alberta at that time. So he went back to the States the following year in 1939. The Peace River Bible Institute invited him to speak up in Grand Prairie, and he had success in there. So these Lowry radio campaigns in the late 1930s had a big influence in Alberta in terms of spreading the gospel and people being converted. So Ellie Maxwell himself described the results of Lowry's campaigns as a kind of a genuine religious awakening in Alberta. For instance, the Evangelical Free Church in 1938 had only one church in Alberta, and 8 years later it had over a dozen churches with pastors who had been trained at the Prairie Bible Institute. So there was religious growth as a result of that. So Ellie Maxwell as well as Aberhart together, their work changed the religious tenor of Alberta during the 1920s and into the 30s. Now, the rift between the Social Credit Party and Prairie Bible Institute actually was healed when, after Aberhart died, Ernest Manning became the premier, and they patched up their differences. So Ernest Manning, he was the one who followed Aberhart. He was originally born in Saskatchewan in 1908, and in 1925 he became an evangelical Christian. He was converted to Christianity by listening to William Aberhart's radio program while he was in Saskatchewan. So Ernest Manning was so taken by Aberhart that when Aberhart opened the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute in 1927, Ernest Manning moved from Saskatchewan to Calgary to be a student there. He was actually the first graduate of that college. He was very successful in all his work, so Aberhart saw Manning's potential and took him under his wing. So he became Aberhart was Manning's mentor, and Manning was Aberhart's closest assistant. So they worked very closely together in the ministry, and then when Aberhart was elected in 1935, Ernest Manning had also run in that election, and he was made a cabinet minister after the election. So Manning, at 27 years old, was the youngest cabinet minister in the British parliamentary family since 1782. So he was the youngest cabinet minister in over 100 years. So when Aberhart died in 1943, the Social Credit Cabinet, or the Social Credit Caucus, selected Manning to be the new premier for Alberta. So Manning became Alberta's premier in 1943. So of course, during Aberhart's time as premier, he had maintained his radio program. Like he had a weekly radio program. He'd had that before he was premier. While he was premier, he did not stop his ministry. He continued preaching on the radio. So Alberta's premier, he was a premier and a radio preacher at the same time throughout that whole period. So when Manning became premier, he did the same thing. He took over the Alberta government as premier, and he also took over Aberhart's religious ministry, and he became the radio preacher weekly on the Canada's National Bible Hour, which is the name of the program. Not only did he take it over, but he actually extended it. But here, this is something really significant to think about. You've got Alberta, he's the premier of the province, and he's also the major radio evangelist for the province at the same time, like throughout that whole period of time. He didn't give up the radio ministry to be premier or one or the other. He was doing them both at the same time. So in the early years of his premiership, Manning, of course, was in Edmonton. He'd be in the legislature, and on a Saturday afternoon, a car would pull up to the legislature, and he'd get in the car. They'd drive him to Calgary. On Sunday, he'd do his radio program from the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute, and then he'd drive back to Edmonton, and on Monday morning, he'd be premier again here in Edmonton. That's how it was the first few years. Of course, eventually, they had to move the ministry up to Edmonton because he didn't have time to travel travel so much. But anyway, Manning not only took over the radio ministry, but he actually began to extend it. During the late 40s and into early 50s, he extended the radio program into BC and Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and even to Nova Scotia, so it was right across Canada. By 1951, the program was being heard on 14 stations across Canada and claimed an audience of 1 million people. An audience of 1 million. Now, Canada's population at that time was about 14 million, so many Canadians knew of Alberta's premier through radio evangelism. So for Manning, not only being premier was important, but it was also important to maintain evangelism. And Manning's biographer wrote this: his mission of leading people toward a personal relationship with God and turning Canada into a nation of Christian citizens would continue throughout Manning's premiership and for many years thereafter. So even after he resigned as premier, he kept preaching on the radio, but he was premier for 25 years. Now, his prominence as a leader, a religious leader within Canada, he used that influence to talk to a number of other premiers and the prime minister of the time in the 1960s, so that those premiers and the prime minister signed a letter inviting Billy Graham to Canada to give his first crusade in Canada. So, of course, Alberta, oil was discovered at Leduc in 1947, and that made Alberta more prosperous than it had been before, and that undoubtedly helped Manning's government because of, with increased prosperity, would increase the popularity of his government, but he was known for managing the government in an efficient, honest manner. He was a builder, and he built the province well. He resigned as premier in 1968, and at the time he resigned, this is how his biographer described the time as when he resigned. He said, at the time Manning resigned, it was noted that he still believed in keeping the Christian Sabbath as a day of rest, despite public opinion to the contrary. He alienated young urban voters by refusing to let theaters show movies on Sundays, and he absented himself from the legislature when the House approved a measure permitting professional sports to be played on Sundays. But despite the fact that some of the people didn't like some of his religious aspects, he nevertheless had a very strong mystique. Like, he was very popular in Alberta, even among people who didn't share his religious beliefs. There was just something about Manning's presence that, exuded confidence, and people believed in him. And as I mentioned, he was a premier for 25 years, and he never lost an election. Every time he ran as premier, he would win a majority government, often with lopsided majorities. So after he resigned as premier, surprisingly, he was appointed to the Senate in 1970 by Prime Minister Trudeau. That's, of course, very surprising because Manning was very conservative and Trudeau was very not conservative. But nobody knows for sure why he appointed Manning to the Senate, but it's believed that, there were backrooms discussions back around 1970 between the social credit people and the liberal people who were trying to work together to create alliance against the Progressive Conservative Party. So it's believed that Trudeau appointed Manning as a kind of an offering to the social credit people to try and bring them on board with the Liberals. It didn't work, but Manning then was in the Senate until 1983. So he was a senator for 13 years. And during that whole time as a senator, he was always still doing his weekly radio program, and he continued preaching on that radio program until 1989. So when he died in 1996, no one questioned his honesty or integrity. Manning had maintained his popularity throughout Alberta, and as I mentioned, he always won re-election, often with lopsided majorities. Now, the Manning name was so well entrenched in Alberta that when Preston Manning in the late 1980s began to create the Reform Party, he had an automatic basis of support of people who respected the Manning name and were willing to support Preston Manning because of his dad. Now, Manning's economic legacy lives on with us today. Ernest Manning was one of the two key people in the initial development of Alberta's oil sands, the other person being Howard Pugh, the president of Sun Oil. So, they began to try and economically develop the oil sands by the 1920s, but they weren't able to develop the technology that would make it viable. So many people gave up on the oil sands and thought it was a hopeless case. But Ernest Manning saw the potential of the oil sands, and he was constantly looking for an investor who would take another chance and try and develop them. And he found Howard Pugh, the president of Sun Oil, was willing to take a chance on that. And in fact, in 1962, Howard Pugh committed $250 million to the creation of Great Canadian Oil Sands because he too saw the potential for the oil sands, and Howard Pugh was very concerned about developing North American energy security. So that was kind of his motivation for doing that. Now, what's very interesting is both of these men, Ernest Manning and Howard Pugh, were evangelical Christians. Manning, of course, was known as being a radio preacher across Canada, but he was also known to some degree in the United States because Manning had did some preaching for Billy Graham and wrote for some of Billy Graham's periodicals. Howard Pugh was also known, like he was a wealthy oil man, and he gave lots of money to Christian causes, and for a while he was known as God's bankroller because he gave so much to evangelical causes. So you have these two evangelical Christians working together for the development of Alberta's oil sands. The Great Canadian Oil Sands plant began construction in 1964. Now, they were still negotiating all the terms of the agreement between the government and Sun Oil Company. And of course, there were some differences between Manning and Howard Pugh on that because Manning wanted Alberta to benefit the most from the oil sands, and Howard Pugh, as president of an oil company, wanted his oil company to benefit the most. So there was some tension there, and the way the tension was worked out was they had a common friend who would be the mediator between them, and that common friend was evangelist Billy Graham. So Billy Graham became a mediator between Ernest Manning, the Premier of Alberta, and Howard Pugh, the president of Sun Oil, to get them to smooth out their differences for the purpose of developing Alberta's oil sands. So in 1967, the Great Canadian Oil Sands plant was officially opened with Manning and Pugh both there. And now we know Great Canadian Oil Sands now, it's known under the name now of Suncor. So it's very important to think that, the oil sands, we benefit from that today, and it's still being developed today, but Ernest Manning was very key to the introduction of the development of the oil sands. So we're still reaping the benefits from the work that he did back in those days. So he resigned in 1968, and he was replaced by a guy named Harry Strom, who is also an evangelical Christian. Now, Harry Strom would only be premier from 1968 to 1971, because in 1971 there was an election and Peter Lougheed beat Harry Strom. But when Harry Strom became premier, one of the first trips he took was to Washington, D.C., because Ernest Manning was the keynote speaker for Richard Nixon's presidential prayer breakfast in that year, and Billy Graham and Howard Pugh were also at that prayer breakfast. Now, it's important to remember, when Manning resigned, there was going to be a leadership contest among members of the Social Credit to see who'd become the leader of the Social Credit Party. And I just want to read a quote here from, Harry Strom won that leadership. I just want to read a brief quote from his leadership brochure, to promote himself, how he was promoting himself to the members of the party. It said this: Harry Strom is an active Christian layman who believes that Christian principles are relevant and applicable to politics and public affairs. He has held executive and teaching positions within the Evangelical Free Church and has long participated in the work of other Christian organizations and service groups. Now, the reason I wanted to read that is because here, this would be 1968, still in the late 1960s, politicians are putting themselves forth as evangelical Christians as a positive thing, as why you would want to support them. So you had radio preachers, as premier from 1935, 1968. Now here in 1968, they're getting a new leader, and he's still this new leader is putting himself forth as an evangelical Christian as a positive thing. This was not an unusual thing. Alberta looked towards evangelical Christians for leadership in politics for many, many years. This was the norm. Now, it's interesting, too, I just put it as a side note, that Premier Harry Strom, his nephew, Ray Strom, is currently the vice president of policy for the UCP here in Alberta. So that family is still serving in Alberta one way or another politically. Now, Manning-era Alberta was different in many respects from other parts of Canada, especially because of the religious influence here, and that was noted, by people in other parts of Canada. The decades-long dominance of social credit, is unusual compared to the rest of the country, and it was partly related to the religious distinctiveness of Alberta in Canada. So in the 1950s, the University of Toronto Press published a 10-volume series of books to explain Alberta to the rest of Canada. This 10-volume series was called Social Credit in Alberta, Its Background and Development. The University of Toronto Press saw Alberta as being so different from the rest of the country that they needed 10 volumes to explain Alberta to the rest of the country. One of those 10 volumes was written by a sociologist named William Mann, and it was about Alberta's religious distinctiveness, because Alberta was so different from the rest of the country. Alberta was without parallel in the rest of the country because of the influence, of evangelicalism here. Let me just read here a quote from William Mann's book when he's looking at Alberta and seeing how different it is from the rest of the country. Mann wrote this: Alberta attracted attention not only by the variety of its religious groupings, but also by the influential role which sectarian religion had played in political and social developments. In what other province of Canada had two successive premiers been active preachers and leaders in a fundamentalist evangelical movement? In what other province had the party in power maintained close, informal ties for, in 1947, 12 consecutive years with a small, little-known evangelical sect? The intimate and unbroken association of Alberta's Social Credit Party and its leaders with the fundamentalist Prophetic Bible Institute spoke clearly of extraordinary sectarian developments. Other religious trends had been almost as amazing. For instance, the non-denominational fundamentalist Bible school at Three Hills, Alberta, the Prairie Bible Institute, had in 1947 the largest daytime enrollment of any seminary or Bible school on the American continent. So in 1947, Prairie Bible Institute here in Three Hills was the biggest seminary and Bible college in North America. Bigger than any seminary or college in Los Angeles or Chicago. Three Hills had the biggest one in North America. So Alberta's religious landscape was very different from the rest of Canada, especially with regards to the strength of evangelical Christianity. Now, Mann goes on to note that Alberta was the leading province in Canada for Bible school-trained preachers, so we had more Bible school-trained preachers than any other province, and also we had there was a bigger evangelical influence in the radio than any other province. Like there was more religious programming in Alberta than any other province in Canada. Now, not everybody was happy with this conservative religious influence in Alberta. There was a journal published by a University of Alberta professor called Edge, which carried articles critical of social credit in Alberta. One 1964 article was critical of social credit government, saying that the Alberta social credit government was basically a theocracy. The person in that article said, "To speak of politics in Alberta is almost a misnomer. There is little serious opposition to the social creditors, who, for all their loyalist oppositionist attacks, are entrenched in a monolithic system of theocracy." And he goes on to write, "The differences between Alberta today and the Calvinist theocracies of early American history are not easily discerned." And he goes on from there to, go on and on about how bad life is in Alberta because of Christians in politics. But, and some of his criticism is very extreme, but I just wanted to show that, this is how some people viewed Alberta at the time. Some people viewed Alberta as kind of like a mini theocracy within Canada. Now, not only was there evangelical Christian influence on Alberta's in the provincial politics, but also in the federal politics. Now, I want to talk about a man named Robert Thompson, who was actually the member of parliament here from Red Deer. He was leader of the Federal Social Credit Party in the 1960s. So he was the leader of the Federal Social Credit Party from 1961 to 1967. And, it wasn't a major party in Canada, but it did have seats in Parliament. So in the 1962 federal election, it elected 30 MPs. In the 1963 election, it elected 24 MPs. And in the 1965 election, it only elected 5 MPs, but that's because there was actually a split between the English-speaking wing and the Quebec wing of the party, so most of the MPs had actually been in the Quebec wing. But Robert Thompson grew up in rural central Alberta. His dad was an avid William Aberhart fan, and Robert Thompson became a fan of Aberhart as well. So Thompson met Aberhart, and Aberhart was very impressed by Thompson, so he started bringing him to his classes, so Aberhart would be instructing Thompson in political and social matters. So basically, William Aberhart became Robert Thompson's political mentor. He was very involved in the Social Credit Party, but then, of course, in 1940, the war started, or 1939, the war started. In 1940, Robert Thompson joined the Canadian Army. To make a long story short, he was sent to Ethiopia in Africa, where he served there. Now, when the war ended, he joined the Ethiopian Civil Service and got to know the country's emperor, Haile Selassie. Then in 1951, he left the Ethiopian Civil Service and worked as a missionary for Sudan Interior Mission. Then he returned to Alberta in 1958 and started giving talks on African political matters because of his first-person experience there. And then a friend of his, a wealthy friend of his, encouraged Robert Thompson to get involved in politics. And that friend of his advocated to Thompson about a particular interpretation of Psalm 33:12. And Thompson wrote this. He said, from that guy's perspective, the verse would mean that the blessing of God would come to Canada through those people who respected the laws of God and would influence their parliament. If there were no practicing Christians in parliament, how could Canada's laws reflect our Christian heritage? So he was encouraged specifically as a Christian to get involved in Canadian politics. So Ernest Manning also encouraged Thompson to run for the leadership of the Federal Social Credit Party, and he did and became leader in 1961. And as I mentioned, he was one of the 30 MPs elected for the Social Credit Party in 1962. Now, Robert Thompson and one other political leader then began holding national prayer breakfasts in 1964. The first national prayer breakfast was held in 1964 for Christian parliamentarians, and it's actually been held every year since, and it's still being held. But Robert Thompson was one of the two people to get that going. Now, as leader of the Federal Social Credit Party, he's quite prominent with, a number of members of Parliament in his caucus, and he would give speeches across the country on various topics. And he became recognized for speaking on small c conservative topics as well as social credit topics. Now, a number of his talks were compiled together in a book called Common Sense for Canadians. This is a copy of the book, and it sold 40,000 copies. Now, selling 40,000 copies of a book today is good, but you remember the population of Canada at that time was less than half than it was now, so selling 40,000 copies was quite a thing back in those days. And what's interesting, too, I bought this in Calgary about 30 years ago, a secondhand book, and there happened to be a brochure in it from the 1965 federal election with, because as I mentioned, Robert Thompson was the MP, the Member of Parliament for Red Deer. And this is his brochure from the 1965 federal election. And it's interesting, he's got his 4 points here. And the first point is he wants to create a society where the individual is the most important factor and where his freedom of choice is protected. So freedom of choice and individual freedom was Thompson's first things. And some of these talks are explicitly Christian too. One of the talks in here, he was talking to a Christian group in Ontario, and he says, Canada needs a John Wesley urgently so. Canadian Christians desperately need a wave of spiritual revival. So already in the 1960s, this political leader from Red Deer was traveling across Canada and talking about the need for a spiritual revival. Now, he served his final term as MP in 1968 to 1972 as a member of the Progressive Conservative Party. And in 1972, he became professor of political science at Trinity Western College, which is now Trinity Western University, and he died in 1997. So that's kind of the social credit period in Alberta's history. I'm just going to finish off here. Like even though social credit faded away and the evangelical influence of social credit faded away, there continued to be on for several years some more Christian conservative influence in Alberta. The best book on it, actually, I didn't bring the book. I brought a photocopy of the front cover. This is a book called God's Province: Evangelical Christianity, Political Thought, and Conservatism in Alberta. So it's referring to Alberta as God's province. I like that. Now, it's written by Clark Bannock. He's actually an academic, a political scientist now at the Augustana campus of Camrose. But if you buy only ever one book on Alberta politics and Christianity and Alberta politics, this would be the one to get, God's Province. So he talks about Ted Byfield. Some of you might remember Ted Byfield, the founder of Alberta Report magazine. It was a very influential magazine in Alberta for many, many years. Like it started in 1973 and it folded in 2003. Had a very large circulation and a large influence on Alberta politics. Now, Ted Morton, who was a political scientist at the University of Calgary and for many years also a cabinet minister, he wrote this about Alberta Report. Like you got to remember that Alberta Report operated during the period, for the most part, before the internet. So this is before the internet, right? And so Morton wrote, Alberta Report was our internet. It was our website, our Facebook and Twitter. In those early years of conservative activism, almost all roads passed through Alberta Report. So Alberta Report was kind of like a central media organization for conservative political activism in Alberta. Now, Clark Bannock, the author of the book, he describes Alberta Report and Ted Byfield's perspective this way. He said, the essence of Byfield's social thought, the message that most easily resonated with readers, was the notion that the vast majority of the ills of contemporary society, including crime, domestic abuse, family breakup, and even rampant government spending leading to chronic deficits, could be traced back to the declining influence of traditional Christian values, especially as they pertained to the norms governing sexual behavior. So the purpose of Alberta Report, much of the thrust of it, was to gradually reestablish traditional Christian morality in the minds of the citizens. So Alberta Report it wasn't explicitly a Christian magazine, but the underlying philosophy was to try and promote Christian values in Alberta. Because Ted Byfield realized that the only way you can change society is if citizens turn to Christ. So that was an important Christian influence in Alberta Report magazine. Now I'll just mention briefly here, Preston Manning, who was the son of Ernest Manning, he of course formed the Reform Party, and Preston Manning himself was an evangelical Christian, so he wasn't as kind of open about it as his father was, but still Preston Manning's influence in Alberta was another evidence of evangelical Christian influence in politics in Alberta. And just to throw a couple more things in here, you might remember Stockwell Day. He was an MLA from Red Deer, and he was, of course, a pastor before he was involved in politics. So that's another example of evangelical Christian influence. Also, Alberta it's primarily in Alberta, people in Alberta who spearheaded the legalization of Christian radio and television stations in Canada. Like until the early 1990s, it was illegal to have a Christian radio station or TV station. Like I mentioned to you, radio preachers. Now, what happened in those days is they would have to purchase airtime on secular stations, like Aberhart and Manning. They'd purchase airtime on secular stations. They didn't have Christian stations because that wasn't allowed. But it was people in Alberta, especially like Alan Hunsberger, who worked tirelessly again for the government to change its policy. It didn't allow religious radio stations until the early 1990s. So the first Christian radio station in Canada was in Calgary in 1994, and the first Christian TV station in Canada was in Lethbridge in 1996, the Miracle Channel. And again, Alan Hunsberger was a major leader in bringing that about. Also, in terms of home education, Alberta has been a leader in home education, which is primarily a Christian movement, and the Homeschool Legal Defense Association of Canada was formed by Albertans. Like it's based in Ontario now, and it covers all of Canada, but was formed by Albertans. Now, why am I talking about all this Christian history, like all this Christian influence in Alberta's politics? I just want to encourage you that Christians have every right to participate in politics in Canada and to advance their values and beliefs just as much as any other citizens. Like this was the norm in Alberta. It was normal in Alberta for evangelical Christians to be active and to be leaders in the political system. This was the norm. This wasn't something unusual or different. Like you might hear people think, well, Christians shouldn't be involved in politics. Well, from Alberta's perspective, that was the major thing during for much of the 20th century. So don't allow yourself to be marginalized by leftists who want to exclude us from the public square. We have every right, as much right as any other citizen, to be involved in politics and in public affairs as anyone else. And Alberta's history shows that can work, and that we've done it before, and there's no problem with that. So with that, I'll end my talk. Thank you.